Hi, this is Videos from the Ville, and I'm Professor Charles Greenawalt. This is State and Local Government, and today our topic is the topic of federalism, one of the most perhaps misunderstood, but one of the most compelling subjects in the study of state and local government, one that constantly needs our attention. Um, what is federalism? What is federalism? This is a question that many of our students are asked as they come to college to define federalism, explain what federalism is, and many are hard pressed to do that. And I'm having trouble with my hair here. I find that federalism is very easy to define. It's just one of three ways to organize sovereignty. One of three ways to organize sovereignty. But then the question that you should ask me is, what is sovereignty? Good question. What is sovereignty? Sovereignty is the supreme dominion, authority or rule. It's the absolute power to rule. You find that the three ways to organize sovereignty are what? One is a unitary method. All the power goes to the central government. Okay? The second way is a confederal way, where all the power is vested in the subnational governments, not in the national government. And that's a confederation or confederal government. And the third way to organize sovereignty is a federal way or federation. Here, power is divided. Power is divided between the national government on one hand and subnational governments on the other. What are some examples of federal systems today? Not just the United States, but we can point to Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Germany, for example, are some federal systems. Well, why should we choose federalism? Why did our founding fathers in 1787 decide to go for federalism? We find that the founding fathers created and chose federalism at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 for a number of reasons. One, the nation had already tried a unitary system under King George III of the United Kingdom and didn't like it. Then we had gone to a confederation. We went to we tried a confederation right after the Revolutionary War. And we decided after a number of years that we didn't like that either. And that is why the founding fathers in 1787 went to Philadelphia to try to revise the Articles of Confederation, to improve the Articles of Confederation and improve the Confederation, to save it. And they discovered after 2 weeks' time that they didn't think they could. So they decided to come up with something different. And they came up with a federal form of organizing sovereignty, something that had never been practiced on a national scale before. So they were doing something quite innovative and quite new and different. So the founding fathers created and chose federalism because we had tried unitary method of organizing sovereignty. We had tried confederal way of organizing sovereignty. So we wanted to try another way. That's number one. Number two, federalism keeps government close to the people, and it increases opportunities to participate in government. In federalism, you have the national government, you have the state government, you have the regional government, you have the county government, local government, and you find that there are lots of opportunities to participate in a federal system. And when you go out into public, for example, chances are you're going to run into your state representative, maybe your state senator, maybe your county commissioner, maybe your school board member. But you find that there are lots of opportunities in the federal system to participate and to have input. Number three, what federalism does is it creates what many political scientists call laboratories of democracy. Laboratories of democracy, when you hear it in this class or in any state and local government forum where they're studying state government, Laboratories of democracy generally refers to a state government, but federalism creates laboratories of democracy, in our case 50 of them. 50 different states. We can use 50 different approaches to solve problems, and we can see which one works. Rather than if we were a unitary state, we'd try one approach to solving a problem at a time, and we'd have to work our way through all the possible solutions. Whereas in the federal state, we have many different states can try many different solutions and see which one works, and we can hopefully solve problems faster that way. Lastly, our founding fathers chose federalism because it allows unity without uniformity. It allows unity without uniformity, and what we mean here is that states that are vastly different from one another, such as Pennsylvania and Louisiana. Pennsylvania and Louisiana can be very, very different, but yet they can still be part of the same country. You find that Pennsylvania law is based on British common law. What is Louisiana law based on? The Napoleonic Code. Pennsylvania has counties for a sub-state government unit. What does Louisiana have? They don't have counties, they have parishes. You find that Louisiana is greatly different. Their political culture is much different than Louisiana's. But yet we can still be one big happy family in the United States of America. It allows unity without uniformity. Well, let's take a look at how federalism has evolved, how federalism has changed in the United States over time. You find that if our founding fathers were to come back right now and look at government, they wouldn't recognize it. And they might be quite surprised, maybe disappointed, I'm not sure. But we find that federalism, as found in the United States today, is certainly not what the founding fathers had in mind in 1787. Things have changed quite a bit. Was it for the better? Was it for the worse? All of us have to make our own decisions on this. But let's take a look at how federalism does change in America. I'm going to give you one evolution, one way that I believe federalism has changed, and then I'm going to go back to Kevin Smith in the book, in our textbook, and he has a slightly different take on it, a slightly different approach. Both are accurate, but they look at it in slightly different ways, but they come out to the same place ultimately. Well, how has federalism evolved in the United States? Well, number one, you have the United States Supreme Court case of McCulloch v. Maryland. And McCulloch v. Maryland was a case in which Maryland needed additional revenue, so they decided to pass a stamp tax. Now, a stamp tax is not a tax on stamps that get put on letters. A stamp tax is a tax that says for any official document to be recognized by that state, it needs to have a stamp, a little rubber stamp with ink on it, placed on it, and maybe a half-cent charge, a quarter-cent charge, something like that. You find that what would happen here would be, if I'm going to register a new will, I'm going to make a deposit at the bank or a withdrawal at the bank. All these legal documents would need to be stamped by the state of Maryland to be recognized as legal, and I'd have to pay for that stamp. So this is what Maryland had decided to do to raise money. Now, the U.S. Bank had already been built, already been created. There was a branch in Baltimore, and the federal officials told the Bank that they were not to pay this, and that no state could force the national government to pay tax to it. And so the head of the Baltimore branch of the U.S. Bank was John McCulloch. John McCulloch was informed not to pay this tax. Well, eventually the state of Maryland comes for its money. John McCulloch said, "I'm sorry, I have done." And so the federal government sued the state of Maryland. And of course, this court case went where? It went into a Maryland court. Who won? Maryland. The federal government didn't like the outcome of the case, so they appealed. Where did it go? To the Maryland State Supreme Court. Who won in the Maryland State Supreme Court? Oh, you'd be surprised. Maryland won. Well, if there is a disagreement between a state government and the national government, who settles it? Well, the United States Supreme Court settles it. And so that's exactly what happened. This went to the United States Supreme Court next. And who won in the United States Supreme Court? Well, America won there. You find that there seems to be, in many instances, a correlation between where is the court case being held and who wins that particular case. We find that Maryland won the first two rounds of that court case, but when it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, the United States won. So we find that the case was upheld, and the tax was upheld, and it would be 50 years until the converse was also put into effect. McCulloch v. Maryland did set forth the principle that states could not tax the federal government. But it was 50 years until the opposite would also be proven, that the federal government was not allowed to tax the states either. Well, number two in the evolution of federalism in the United States is the nullification doctrine. Most of you are very familiar with the nullification doctrine. The nullification doctrine really takes off in the aftermath of the War of 1812. We find that there are lots of southern states who would like to keep the institution of slavery, and yet there are many people in the national government who would like to do away with slavery. And so if the national government was going to pass legislation that would not be kind to their wishes, the southern states said they were simply going to nullify those laws. Those laws were unconstitutional in their minds, and they wouldn't observe them. They'd nullify them. That's what the nullification doctrine is. Find that a few years ago, the nullification doctrine was again cited by some southern politicians again who were not happy with some of the things that were going on in Washington, D.C. Rick Perry brought this out in a big way when he was wrapping up his time as governor of Texas. There was a war of words between the state of Texas and the national government a few months ago, and that had extended way back into the past as well. And we find that Rick Perry called a press conference at the Alamo, and he went out from behind the rostrum during one point of the press conference, drew a line in the sand, and said to all the reporters, you know that Texas was an independent republic before joining the United States for once, and it could become one again. We will, if necessary, take Texas out of the United States, and we will become an independent country again. Somewhat of a idle threat, perhaps, but it was good theater. It was good theater, and he was reasserting what? He was reasserting the nullification doctrine. Well, the third stage in the evolution of federalism in the United States is the Civil War. We find that Shelby Foote, the great historian of the Civil War, and he's seen all through Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. That was done several years ago. Shelby Foote just passed on a few years ago, but Shelby Foote often said that there never was a time in American history until the Civil War, there was never a time when the issue of slavery wasn't coiled under the desk of every congressman, just waiting to strike to see what the country would do. That the country was going to have to continue with slavery or end slavery. That couldn't continue into this long period of agony. So the Civil War, of course, eventually does come to the fore with the election of Abraham Lincoln and the first Republican president, and the fact that many southern states wanted to interpret Abraham Lincoln as being a rabid abolitionist, when in fact he probably, all Lincoln would have done at first would have been to restrict slavery and to maintain it in the South, not allow any western states to join the slave states. He just would have tried to isolate it and restrict it and hope that it would eventually go away, would shrivel up and be replaced. But the southern states didn't see it that way. The Republican Party was built and created to end slavery, so they believed that the struggle was on, and of course this results ultimately in the Civil War and South Carolina taking action against Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. So the Civil War is a huge step in this evolution of federalism. Number 4 is the doctrine of dual sovereignty. When the war ends, you find that since we don't have the nullification doctrine anymore, what was true under the doctrine of dual sovereignty is the states and the federal government agreed that some things the states did, some things the federal government did, and that was the dual sovereignty. The states did some things and the federal government did others, and they could be kept separately. Well, the doctrine of dual sovereignty runs from after the Civil War all the way to the 1960s, essentially. And finally, in the 1960s, with the New Deal of Lyndon Johnson, we eventually recognized the supremacy of the national government in the evolution of federalism in the United States. Okay, so we have the doctrine of dual sovereignty. The doctrine of dual sovereignty then comes into play after the Civil War, as states are recognized as being responsible for some things and the national government responsible for others. As I said, this continued to the 1960s when we have, of course, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson coming into play. And Lyndon Johnson believed that he was simply taking the legacy of John F. Kennedy and bringing it to pass. So we find that the doctrine of dual sovereignty ends and the supremacy of the national government is recognized by just about everyone. The supremacy of the national government is what we see today. And these are the stages of evolution in the United States. We find that Kevin Smith has his own conception of how federalism developed in the United States. and it goes through 5 different phases which are listed in your textbook. In your textbook, you'll see that we have this period of dual federalism between 1789 and 1933, cooperative federalism between 1933 and 1964, centralized federalism between 64 and 80, new federalism between 80 and 2002, and ad hoc federalism between 2002 and the present. I read over many times his history of the development of federalism, and I like it. I think it's all true. It's just another way of looking at how this period of time evolved and what was involved with it. This is an excellent way to detail the development of federalism, so I want you to be aware of that as well. Okay? So we get to the point where we have to ask ourselves, though, how do we evaluate federalism? If we are driving through New England, I had a friend driving through New England a very short time period ago, and I said, well, how do you like Rhode Island? And he said, well, I must have blinked and I missed it. Do we really need Rhode Island? Do we need 2 Dakotas? Do we need a South Dakota and North Dakota? Wouldn't 1 Dakota be fine? Do we really need to have 3 states? Delaware used to be part of Pennsylvania. Why isn't it part of Pennsylvania again? We could take Delaware back. And heck, why don't we have Maryland here too? We could have a new state. Instead of have Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, we could take those 3 states and combine them into 1. Penn-Mardell. In Penn-Mardell, we have the most impressive and beautiful state capital in the country, according to National Geographic. So we'll put the legislature in Harrisburg. The governor always likes to have a nice boat. So we'll let the governor's mansion and the governor be in Annapolis. And then we'll let, of course, the state Supreme Court be in Dover, Delaware. And now we've taken 3 states and we have 1. The Federal Reserve System has a system like this, where they've taken all 50 states and they've organized them into something like 14 different regions. Why can't we have 14 different regions instead of 50 different states? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. One, under our system, you find that under our system, you find that all the both the states and the federal government have guaranteed rights of existence. They have guaranteed rights of existence, so we can't do away with any one of them. So that's a big reason right then and there. Okay, but how do we evaluate federalism? We tend to evaluate federalism based on what's more important for us. What's more important, equality or participation? In federalism, we get to participate. Lots of chances to participate. Okay, so that's one of the beauties of federalism. Lots of chances to participate. But we find in looking at this situation, is participation the most important thing, or is equality? Or is it good equality? Which is more important to you? Under a system of federalism, we are not equal. The rules and regulations in one state are not equal to the rules and regulations in another. So under a system of federalism, we're not equal. But you find that we do have lots of chances to participate. So that is the answer to that particular question. Well, when we look at federalism, there's 2 different meanings of federalism. We have loose constructionists and strict constructionists. The strict constructionists, led by Thomas Jefferson, for example, they argue for the supremacy of the states' rights, for the powers of the state. They said the powers of the national government should be closely cropped, closely cut back, and watched like a hawk. So those are the strict constructionists, who are never quite comfortable uh, dra- uh, relying on Washington and relying on the power of Washington. And we have the loose constructionists. The loose constructionists are led by people such as Alexander Hamilton. They argue for the supremacy of the national government, and they believe that the national government. The loose constructionists argue for the supremacy of the national government. They define the powers of the national government very broadly, very loosely. Now, what you find is, as we go through this subject of federalism, we have to encounter the grant and aid programs, because grant and aid programs are tied up at the middle of the politics of federalism, that's for sure. Let's take a look at the politics of federalism in just a minute. Okay, the politics of federalism can be seen through the grant and aid programs. Now, what is a grant and aid program? The grant and aid program are monies that are made available by Congress to state governments and local governments to be spent by them in accordance with the standards and conditions that were given through the grant. Find that grant and aid programs originally begin in 1808. They begin in 1808, and they begin under the Jefferson administration. Thomas Jefferson is the first professor to, as he was, and the first president to deal with grant and aid programs. So the grant and aid programs began in 1808 under the Jefferson administration. They gave Congress Congress gave them $200,000 to the states to pay for their militias. Okay. We find, however, even though grant and aids began under Jefferson, we find that the grant and aid program remains small in size, and it really didn't affect many people when it first was initiated. So the grant and aid programs remained few and small in size until the early 20th century. We find that in the early 1930s, this system began to grow and grow and grow, because you find that it helps state and local governments deal with a problem that they weren't good at otherwise, and it would help them resolve a dilemma. For example, we have the Great Depression. The state and local governments are all out of money to help people eat. We find that there are people lined up in the streets to eat. The national government has the money. The state and local governments don't. But there is an understanding that the federal government may not simply give money to local governments to put on the street. So the grant and aid program did a big service to everyone. The grant and aid program allowed the federal government to share its money with states and localities, so the local or state government got the money that was being withheld, and they got the money, and there was a way around this situation. So the problem is the federal government had the money, state and local governments weren't allowed to go out and do these things, so they would be able to solve the problem by letting the national government give them the money to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. Now, what we find is there are a number of presidential packages of grants, of aid to the various administrations. Let's take a look at these presidential packages of domestic programs. We find that in the 20th century, we'll start in the 20th century, we said the grant and aid program began in 1808. Remember, we said the size of grant programs and the number was few until the latter part of the 1960s. What are the presidential packages? I want you to be familiar with all of them and be able to associate them with the president and be able to know who did what. Well, you have first of all the Square Deal. The Square Deal is the first one in the 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt. And what was the Square Deal? The Square Deal of Teddy Roosevelt was he just believed every American should have a home, should have a cooker to cook food, a pot on the cooker, a chicken in the pot, and a car in the driveway, or a way to get to work. Maybe it would be a bike, maybe it would be light rail, but the Square Deal of Teddy Roosevelt said every American should have a job, should have a way to get to the job, and a house, some kind of a dwelling. So that was Teddy Roosevelt with the Square Deal. Then we had FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, had the New Deal. And the New Deal you've all heard of or seen over the years. The New Deal. Then we had the Fair Deal. Fair Deal with we had the Square Deal with Teddy Roosevelt. Then we have the New Deal with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The New Deal is one of the three largest expansions of federal government power and federal borrowing that we see in our lifetimes. You find that the three major expansions of the federal government would have been the New Deal under FDR, which we're going to talk about in a minute, the Square Deal, the New Deal under FDR, the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, and the expansion of the government, spending of money by Barack Obama. We find that these are the three major expansions of the federal government in our lifetime. Again, they were the New Deal of FDR, the New Deal of FDR, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and the new package from the package that had been put into place by Barack Obama. It doesn't have a moniker yet and was never given a name. But those are the three massive expansions of the federal government during our history. Again, the New Deal, the Great Society, and Barack Obama's two stimulus packages, which were something like, $1.8 trillion. Okay, well, let's take a look as to why are all these programs attractive. Why is federal money attractive to state and local officials? Let's see if I can get that. Well, this brings us to the politics of federalism and why this money that was made available through these grant programs was attractive to state and local officials. What was so attractive about it? Well, a couple different reasons for this. During the 19th century and essentially the 20th century, the federal government always had budget surpluses. They always had brought in more money than they spent. So it was very good for the states and localities to be able to rely on the federal government having more money than it needed, and they could always bail them out. So these are 4 reasons why federal money is attractive to state and local officials. One is the federal government always had more money than they needed. 2, the federal government had revenues from personal income tax, which were very steady and very sure. Number 3, we find that federal money appeared to be free money to many state officials and local officials. It wasn't free money at all, but appeared to be. And number 3, the third reason why federal money is attractive to state and local government officials is that the federal government manages our currency. So it's thought that if it runs out of money, all it has to do is fire up the printing presses and print more. So these are the reasons why federal money was always attractive to state and local officials. And so I believe on reflection that is all for federalism. We have covered no, excuse me, what am I saying here? After a pause, yes, those are the 4 reasons why federal money is attractive to state and local officials. We find that, yes, what happens, of course, is that after 1808, when the Jefferson administration creates grants remain few in number and small in size until the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, we find that grants are a great way to solve the situation where the national government had money and state and local governments didn't, but yet the national government wasn't allowed to go and have direct service delivery in the states and the localities. So they could simply give the money through a grant to the state and locality and have them solve the problem that way. So in the 1930s, we find in the Great Depression that grants begin to grow in response to solving the Great Depression. Now that the Great Depression is solved by the Second World War, and then we're again cruising along until the Great Society in the mid to late 1960s, when again you have a great expansion of the federal government, and again then you have great proliferation of grant and aid programs, and this is how federalism has grown. Let's see. Now, what we talked about the reasons why the federal money appeared very attractive to state and local officials. We find that, again, during the first half of the 20th century and the 19th century, the federal government had budget surpluses. The federal government got revenues from the personal income tax. The federal government managed our currency, so state and local governments could say if they need more money, all they have to do is print it. And federal money appeared to be free money. When your congressman brought home money for a local dam or another project, it appears to be free money. It's not, but it appears. So all those reasons make federal money look very attractive to state and local officials. And you find that this is indeed what is happening during the New Deal. That the New Deal is ended by the Second World War, and then when we have a little bump after the Second World War with the coming home of millions of men and women, Harry Truman calls the Fair Deal. The Fair Deal was just a concern about the economy collapsing because there's no war effort and all these men and women are coming home. There was a fear that we would lapse back into the Great Depression. So Harry Truman was concerned about that, and we find Congress was so concerned that they created the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. Harry Truman said he didn't want them. Congress forced them down his throat, along with a requirement that they report to the Congress every year. And Harry Truman said, no, I don't want them. But everyone was concerned, were we going to lapse into another depression? It didn't occur, but here we have the Square Deal under Teddy Roosevelt, the New Deal under FDR, Fair Deal under Harry Truman, and then we find that we are going towards the Kennedy administration, and we have the New Frontier. Now, what happened is the New Frontier. What does the New Frontier consist of? The New Frontier consists of, President Kennedy decides to expand NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, send man to the moon in 10 years, and we get there in 9. So it's an expansion of NASA. The New Frontier consists of, he decides to increase the size of America's conventional war-making apparatus. He felt that it had been neglected and we were falling behind the Soviets. We weren't, but he authorizes an expansion of conventional weapons. He calls for the development of the Green Beret, which is a kind of soldier who will be able to speak the language of the people where they are based, where they are fighting, and they train indigenous peoples to defend themselves. So we have the Green Beret as part of the New Frontier. We have President Kennedy also creating the Peace Corps. This was a program that was created by Dwight David Eisenhower, but it was only conducted in the northern part of South America and in Central America. And Kennedy thought, why don't we do this across the globe? And named it the Peace Corps, much better name, and sent it around the world. These are all parts of the New Frontier. But of course, President Kennedy is assassinated. He has his eye on civil rights as well after he would be reelected in 1964. Of course, he never had the chance. So Lyndon Johnson, as vice president from Texas, takes the presidency and decides to take the mantle of John F. Kennedy, and he creates another package of domestic programs called the Great Society. And Lyndon Johnson was trying to win the war in Vietnam. At the same time, he was trying to win the war against poverty. Very difficult to do both. And this is where he got into trouble. Now, this is exactly what happened. We set up these programs under the Great Society. Under the New Deal. Under the New Deal, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we set up programs, the national government working with the state governments and the local governments, all working together. They defined the problems and they decided what was the best way to solve them. Well, this continues all the way to the Kennedy administration. You find that when the national government was planning a program, it would go out into the field and see if the states and localities wanted it, needed it, and how it should be run. And they solicited this advice constantly. Well, when President Kennedy went to Washington, he took his best advisors from Yale and Brown and Harvard, and this was his brains trust, and took that with him to Washington, D.C. He filled his administration with PhDs from Yale, Harvard, and Brown. And, if you know a PhD from Harvard, they don't necessarily believe that they need the input of state and local government officials to help them make determinations in regard to programs. Whereas before, under the administration of FDR, under the administration of Harry Truman, the administration of Dwight David Eisenhower, when any new programs are being considered, there would be consultation between state, federal, and local officials. That went the way of the dodo bird when John F. Kennedy comes into office. But then what also is happening is you have the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement is one where now you have all these PhDs in the White House, in the executive branch, and they are seeing this resistance to civil rights. And they're seeing it by state and local government officials. And they decided to paint a broad brush. They decided all state and local government officials were the same, whereas this was only happening in the Deep South. Now all of a sudden, they didn't have to go to Tallahassee, Florida, or to Montgomery, Alabama to consult on a program, but there's no reason in the world why they couldn't have gone to Lansing, Michigan, why they couldn't come to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, why they couldn't go to Boston, Massachusetts and consult with those state and local people. So this is something that now Lyndon Johnson is president, Kennedy has died, and we find that Johnson, of course, has greatly expanded the federal government, just like FDR did. And now we're trying again to win the war in Vietnam and win the war on poverty. And you find that he does not continue this process of consultation. A lot of the people that Kennedy brought to Washington are still there, and so they know best, and they don't need to talk to the regular people for their advice. And you find out there's all kinds of programs set up on the Great Society that are well-intentioned, but they don't necessarily work, and they were all set up without consultation. So this leads to Richard Nixon's campaign, and when Richard Nixon is running for president, his domestic affairs advisor, John Ehrlichman, hears constantly the complaint from state and local officials that, gee, there are all these programs that Washington has, and they must be able to help someone, but they don't help us. So Richard Nixon said, I'm going to have the new federalism, and the new federalism will be something very different from what came before. And that is that Richard Nixon now is going to introduce something entirely new. They were going to introduce block grants. They were going to introduce block grants. Block grants will be pools of funds, money that was dedicated to just one subject area. And if you needed a grant in that area, you'd write for that particular program. And even that was considered to be restrictive by some state and local officials. So eventually John Ehrlichman and the Nixon administration has set up something called general revenue sharing. General revenue sharing is just the federal government giving money to the states and localities in return for the ability to monitor that money and oversee it. But you'd let the federal government just give money to the states and localities to be spent on anything they needed it on. So that's general revenue sharing. Now, general revenue sharing was meant by President Nixon. It was meant for the Mississippi Delta. It was meant for Watts. It was meant for the worst communities in the worst parts of the country. But we find that what happened is when these new sources of revenue are set up by the Nixon administration, block grants and general revenue sharing, that it is, what happens here is that the block grants are a great success. General revenue sharing, everybody wants that money too. But what is happening, the money was meant to go to some of the worst parts of the country, and it wasn't going there. But it was always going to Stamford, Connecticut, and Prince George's County, and Maryland, and so forth. Some Stamford, Connecticut, some of the most affluent areas, because the poor areas may not have known about the programs. They didn't have enough manpower or training to get the paperwork and to fill it out on time and to submit it on time. But the rich counties always were able to do that. So general revenue sharing was very well intentioned, but what happened is Ronald Reagan was looking at it, and in his second term he realized that the money wasn't going where it was prioritized to go, so he eliminated general revenue sharing. And what you find in federalism is there a rivalry among the states developing, that the different states all try to get a hold of the resources of the federal government in a grand competition against one another. And who was winning? The South was winning. Why was the South winning? The South had an advantage. How in the government, who decides who's going to spend money? The legislature. How's the legislature organized? It's organized into committees. Who's the most important person in every committee? The chairman. And how do you get to be chairman of a congressional committee? By seniority, by being there the longest. And so we find that Southerners were always there the longest. We find that in the South there's a tradition of personal politics, and Southerners tend to elect their congressmen over and over again, where Northerners don't. So you find that as this period of federalism progressed, the people who had more and more control of federal money were Southerners. You find there was a great rivalry among the states for this money, but the money was always going mostly to the South because the committees were controlled by Southern chairmen. So there's this rivalry. We find that this after the National Governors Conference, almost every year, there's a press conference by the New England governors and the northern governors, Middle Atlantic state governors, saying that it's not fair that the southern states get far more money than the northern states do. But we find that the Reagan administration called in everyone, and they said, this has got to stop, this isn't fair, please try to do a better job. And so there's perhaps less rivalry among the states now, but all of them would like to get their hands on the money in Washington, D.C. But this is the Southern advantage in the issue of struggle for money through federalism. Okay? Well, I think that's it for federalism. I will finish this particular episode, and we'll be back in a minute with a new episode. Okay, hang on.